Hello friends. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. It is a traditional platform of 24 channels. I am pleased to introduce our guest. This is Russian human rights activist and YouTube blogger Mark Feygin. Mark, hello, good evening.
I am glad to welcome all the viewers of Channel 24.
I want to remind our viewers that this is a live stream, so as always, be active. This is how the YouTube algorithm works. Put likes, write adequate, constructive questions, we will bring out and talk, discuss. Mark, first of all, of course, let's remember Summit BRICS on October the 22nd and 24th. Kazan, 36 participants, 22 heads of state. Many did not go, many refused to join, many were not allowed to join because India and other countries opposed it. 134 points of the Kazan Declaration, how to characterize them. In my opinion, it seems that each country added 2 or 3 of its own points, which were then combined, as if glued together with super glue, and submitted for consideration. There is even a clause about protecting cats from India.
I would not evaluate each item separately. This does not say much about the summit. I would still try to give some characteristics in general, since there have been no significant progress, either in terms of economic integration or in issues related to the attempt to create an alternative to SWIFT, as well as in the field of mutual settlements. There has also been little progress in moving away from first world currencies such as the dollar. Well, in general, there are no such significant results. Moreover, you see, when holding such a summit and coming to Moscow, the issues are still paramount, even if they are serious, without articulating, these are military issues, you know, because everyone is talking about them. China in the person of Xi Jinping spoke about them. India spoke about these issues. This is the main country of the BRICS, but Brazil was not represented there. Lula, he did not come under the pretext of injury. Some other participants also spoke about this. What is this evidence about? About the fact that the issues of war are key to understanding the future of the organization, and even with the participation of the Russian Federation. Guterres, by the way, also spoke about this, although it all looks extremely helpless, and it is absolutely obvious that this is not the forum at which issues of war and peace should be resolved, by and large, since Moscow is the host of this forum. That is, the same Guterres did not go to the Peace Formula event in Switzerland near Lucerne, but he went to Kazan. Also strange. I think that not recently this is why Zelenskyy did not agree with his arrival in Kiev, which is very logical. You like to go to Kazan, to Russia, and solve problems there. Why are you cruising around and trying to pose as some kind of important mediator, which neither the UN nor Guterres are? But nevertheless, they are still forced to raise these issues. And Turkey. In the person of Erdogan, it became known that Erdogan allegedly handed over to Kiev Zelenskyy Moscow's proposal for a ceasefire and the like. I believe that this is all manipulation, but nevertheless, it exists. As for the organization in general, do you understand how the organization is developing? It is not developing in any way, nothing has changed significantly. But the very fact that it is being held in Kazan under the chairmanship of Russia, the host country, shows that, well, at least, Russia is coping with isolation. That is, well, not among the countries of the First World, but among the countries of the Second and Third World, which mainly form the BRICS, it interacts with them, and no one refuses to cooperate with Moscow and even visit Moscow. By and large, the organization did not squeeze Moscow out of its ranks, did not freeze its membership for a while the war continues. No, but Moscow has more or less fulfilled all the tasks set. It has fulfilled them in one form or another, let's put it this way. That is, it was important to emphasize that there is no isolation, and the Moscow leadership somehow coped with this. So, in general, I would assess that Moscow, despite all the difficulties, obvious difficulties, still managed to show that Russia and Putin himself, despite the warrant to prosecute him as a war criminal, despite Moscow's position as a sanctioned entity, nevertheless retains influence in organizations such as BRICS and the like. So, in general, Moscow can consider this part successful for itself. Everything else, practical results, negotiations and everything else, do not have such a big role.
Mark, do I understand correctly that the goal of showing that Putin is not isolated has indeed succeeded, but the BRICS, which was created many years ago, has nothing that would allow it to become an alternative body, for example, the EU or the UN, because there are too many differences. You mentioned, yes, Turkey, Pakistan, India, the enemy of Pakistan, trying to somehow mold what does not mold.
Look, in general, the BRICS organization is an organization of the second or third world, that is, they're always trying to challenge or take on the role of one of the comparable countries, the 7 countries, the same as the community, the Western community, of course, a comparable role. China is trying to achieve it, claiming it, primarily because it has, as it believes, certain prerequisites for this, historical, demographic, economic and others. The rest of the countries are like satellites in relation to China, of course, because China is the most powerful economy. With India in part. But, you see, it is easier to come to an agreement with a Western country than with these countries of the second and third worlds, because Western countries, if we are talking about the Western, are actually homogeneous. These are the countries of the Christian area, these are the countries whose origin is, if you like, historically, Europe. And, in general, they are more or less countries of political democracy. But the countries of the second and third world are a motley environment. There are totalitarian dictatorships, there are absolutely savage barbaric regimes, there, I don't know, like Iran, there are conditional democracies, such national democracies as India and so on. In such countries, not to mention different civilizational strata, some are non-believers, as in China, others are Muslims, Shiites or Sunnis, and still others, generally speaking, Hindus, and so on. It's hard for them to find something in common, you know. They are trying to start from the economy, that it is primary. That it is precisely economic competition with the countries of the first world that ensures their unity. But it doesn't work that way. Almost all of the countries listed, the main countries of this part of the world, the bottom of the map, as we call it, so they all depend on the West. From its investments, from its technology, from cooperation with it, from trade and so on. If they were self-sufficient, what they strive for and what they declare, they would get rid of this dependence, because, imagine, the same Chinese economy, if all Western investments and the like are pulled out of it, it will lose a lot and very significantly. For the West, yes, it is also important to cooperate on the part of the second and third worlds, which play a role for them in the workshop, as they were often called in China. But it is already possible to do without this, to begin this process of moving away from production dependence. It is possible, and this process is slowly, very, so to speak, shaky. Yes, because modern technology, a new scientific and technological revolution, it has also made it possible to robotize production, and this process is accelerating in the West. Well, maybe not as much as we would like. In 10 years it will not be possible to get rid of this dependence on production, but the processes will continue. Therefore, these BRICS countries or similar countries of the second and third world can never defeat the primacy of the West. For this reason, if they themselves begin to produce technologies, to produce scientific and technological means of production, then, of course, this competition will be significant. And now there is nothing of the sort. That's all.
Mark, you remembered Guterres, who came to Kazan, ate Easter cake and smiled sweetly.
Did he eat Easter cake?
It seems yes, it doesn't matter. What is the point? He hugged Lukashenko, with Putin. It would seem, yes, UN Secretary General, this is the United Nations, you have to balance. But you mentioned the Swiss Peace Summit. He did not come there because he had more important things to do. But there was none. So, and now he has arrived, and we know that there is a warrant from the International Criminal Court. This is a sabotage. How can you assess Guterres' visit at all, and why?
You know, Guterres is going because he has a direct interest in cooperation with Moscow, as well as with the countries that participated in the BRICS summit, with China and everyone else. This is also the material interest, well, in a broad sense, not just of Guterres personally, but of all these donor organizations for Russia, for the UN. In general, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, a founding country, and there is tremendous cooperation with Moscow on all peripheral issues. Not on the issues of the war in Ukraine, but on others. He cannot ignore Moscow. Plus, he also needs to show the need for the UN. It is necessary to show all the time that this is not a useless corrupt nest that has outlived its time, generally speaking, into a universal institution that claimed to be a planetary government after World War II, and ends up as an organization that deals with anything except the actual issue of peace and international security. There, the WHO is the main organization now, and international healthcare, and the Red Cross, and so on, which, in general, do not have any important global function. Well, they partly carry it, but they do not solve the main issues of war and peace. Understand, and Guterres wanted to do just that, but I declared there that it is necessary to reconcile, to end the war. He declared this, talked about it, right, that is, he did not accuse Moscow of what he should have done, that it is you who are the aggressors, and that you are undermining international security, its system in general, international law and so on. He also said that everyone should live in a dormitory in a single house, respects the sovereignty of territorial values. And who violated it? This is generally a strange conversation. After all, everything there is hidden behind the fact that it is impossible to behave like this with Moscow. If we treat it more harshly, then we will not be able to conduct a dialogue, and the organization's goal, as a means, as a form, is to constantly conduct a dialogue. Well, it's very convenient, you know, to constantly conduct some kind of fruitless dialogue, which has been going on for 2.5 years, and it does not bring any results at all. Therefore, in fact, he should act out this situation publicly. So he came to Moscow, and then he would go to Kiev. I'm also carrying some offers. What offers can Guterres bring? And what did you do before that? And what is your mission? What is your role? Just to come, to highlight your presence and the participation of the UN in the BRICS summit. Well, very good, but what is the use of this for Ukrainians? Completely incomprehensible. That is, he looks like some kind of social activist, you know. There are social activists who go to all the events all the time, actively participate in the table d'hôte, you know, a common table when they treat them. I went out, ate cakes, drank coffee, and then I had eaten a loaf of bread, or, as you say, a cake. I could not distinguish it. In Tatarstan, it is unlikely that he was served a cake, most likely some kind of loaf. He devoured, sat down, went. That's about how his mission is. And what exactly, what was its mission? Someone will say, well, why do you demand too much? Really? And I saw how Guterres and his officials on the conflict in the Gaza Strip were crawling out in the Middle East. So he carried it there, left stone upon stone from Israel. What's in the cemetery, he says, children in the Gaza Strip, you know. And then I have such a simple question, why don't you talk about the children's cemetery in Ukraine? That is, it is safe with Israel, because Israel gives you the most that it can give you, persona non grata. And it burns with Moscow. Dangerous, you know. You need to somehow act out so that it does not affect your status, relationships, and so on. That is, it is much more dangerous to take a swing at Russia than at Ukraine or Israel. It turns out like this. That is, there he can show principle, demand something, despite the fact that Israel in many ways, so to speak, backs down time after time. If they could, they would turn everything into one continuous bunker for. And this doesn't happen anyway, you see. And from this point of view, this is cynicism and duplicity of the UN, which is called, especially such a big war that is now raging in Eastern Europe, well, how to use universal efforts, you see. The principles do not tolerate regionalism, bias, cynicism, and so on. Do you either defend peace and security and clearly determine, in accordance with the UN Charter, who is the aggressor, who is the victim country, or why is your organization needed at all? But this question is sounding louder and louder, and not only in our programs, or there in Ukraine, or in other places. But then it is simply completely unclear what their role is. And it turns out that there is no role. This is the role of the transfer link of money. They collect, like a nipple, money, draw it in from the participants, and then distribute it to some programs, not forgetting about themselves. Well, like, for example, support and assistance to the Gaza Strip. Therefore, in fact, the presence of Guterres is simply beneficial to Moscow. Notice how Moscow comments on the role of the UN. To preserve forever, the UN is the most important, universal institution. It is very convenient to hide behind the UN in the continuation of the war. After all, Moscow said that the BRICS summit among its participants finds more understanding of Moscow's position on the war in Ukraine and what it is doing in Ukraine. This is probably not true. And we did not see this in any specific comment on this matter of statements. We did not see it either, but the very fact of this event, the very fact of the presence of the UN Secretary-General at this event really creates the impression that Moscow is doing well and the war in Ukraine, which it started, does not affect the position and status of Moscow itself and Putin himself.
By the way, Mark, don't you think that Guterres is a little reminiscent of Gerhard Schröder, who, after his position as Secretary-General, is looking for a cozy place and can also crawl out somewhere?
You see, it's always a speculative conversation. When this happens, then we will say for sure that this is what he tried for. We cannot know this in advance, what he is talking about when he meets with Putin. Well, how can we now accuse him of political corruption? We have no reason for this that he, after the post of General Secretary, stopped by some kind of sinecure. We don't know, but outwardly, it all looks like ingratiation, planning with Putin, who heads a huge corruption trough, which, so to speak, can be given out to anyone, as much as he wants. Maybe so. And you know, Putin must be given his due, he does not offend anyone. Remember the story not only with Switzerland, but also with Nigel, the former Austrian foreign minister. So she stays there day and night in this Russia. So what, and how? Well, we have seen examples of this, and other Italian politicians, and all sorts of others. Why don't we believe that this is possible here? But I repeat once again, we cannot accuse him in advance of the fact that at the end of his cadence as Secretary-General of the United Nations, he will definitely fall into some kind of Russian gas monopoly, or an oil monopoly, or some other similar one, because this has not happened yet. We give him an advance to improve, as they say, but in principle this is not ruled out.
Mark, you say that Russia and Putin are satisfied with the UN, because there is a veto power. And many say that it is necessary to change the structure of the UN. And to be honest, we know that in the UN, in the Security Council, there are countries that won World War II. Well, where is India? Where is Germany? Where are the other countries, right? This needs to be changed somehow. Will it be possible? Unlikely. Because it is very difficult, there is a veto right.
I will tell you this, nothing can be changed within the UN itself. Whoever says it, I know, there are voices that the right to admit Russia as the successor of the Soviet Union has become illegal, because Ukraine and Belarus had representation in the UN in the Soviet years. It was Stalin's own game when creating the UN. There were many compromises, part of which was the fact that the UN was located in New York, as well as the fact that votes, in addition to the Soviet Union, also gave to Belarus and Ukraine. There were many such things, few people remember them now. But I do not believe that there is a mechanism within the UN that makes it possible to change the existing state of affairs, which is enshrined in the Charter, and was originally agreed upon by the 5 founding countries of the UN, the victorious countries in World War II. Within the UN, this can no longer be changed. World War II ended a long time ago, you know, almost 80 years ago, well, 75, it doesn't matter. But the situation looks like preserving this obsolete institution is the same as if the League of Nations still existed, which disappeared in connection with the Finnish War. But there were a number of processes that, in general, it failed, to put it mildly. That is, the organization of the League of Nations should also go nowhere, like the League of Nations, and some new organization should be created on its ruins. I often hear talk that such an organization can be created, but only as a result of a world war, as often happens. It is a good question whether it will be the result of a world war, or whether it will be possible to avoid this world war. There are different ways in which humanity will develop. An alternative UN can be its own UN for our own, you see. If Western countries, their Western democracies are like them, almost 105 to 110 countries, well, there are different estimates, hesitant, but, nevertheless, this is almost half of all countries on Earth, even a little more. Why don't they create their own separate UN? I don't understand. There was an attempt. The Union of Democracy, so to speak, in absentia, online even held such an event in 2022, in September, they held such online communication. And everyone was abandoned, because the war did not prevent this, and a lot of other problems and worries. In fact, This is not a stupid globalist idea at all, because something needs to be done so that the current UN ceases to be the exclusive body of universal values and universal norms. It has not performed such functions for a long time. It is impossible to have the same voting rights between Iran and, I don't know, Liechtenstein or anything like that. That's impossible. These are different countries, some of which deny international law, while others follow it. And there is nothing you can do about it. I'm not even talking about humanistic values and the like. And in general, the understanding of progress as it is, as the avoidance of wars and disagreements between countries and peoples. Well, some hold on to this right, and others do not, and how do you combine them? You know, in order to create a pool of countries, I don't know, half of humanity, that would be able to implement at least their norms of coexistence not only unfoundedly, but also realistically. And this cannot be done in today's UN, because the organization of large nations proceeds from universal values that do not exist. For Islamic civilization or for Christian civilization they are absolutely different, they will never agree. For example, this is not bad, this is a statement, you see. It is necessary to change either one or the other, and it is impossible to try to find the result between the two, as has been seen for decades. And therefore, those who are able to adhere to the same rules and values must first unite, and those who remain outside of it should think about how they will exist in this difficult world, you see. With all the goodies for those who will remain among the Western democracies and with those problems, and checks and damages that will remain outside its borders. And sir, in general, you can always hide behind UN membership as a way, positioning yourself as subjects of international politics, international law, which is what the most terrible strange outcasts do, from Belarus, North Korea, Iran and the like. And now Russia too.
Mark, by the way, if we talk about Putin's statement at the BRICS, he recalled that he wants to end the war as soon as possible and sit down at the negotiating table, but, as always, like Lavrov, he speaks taking into account the realities on the battlefield. Well, of course, yes, they annexed it, included it in the constitution. And here it seems to me that there is nothing to say, because he repeated what he always repeats, but we move on. For example, Scholz said last Wednesday in the Bundestag that he was ready to negotiate with Putin, but today, on the 25th meeting in Modi, he said that I allegedly want India to be a mediator in the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And here is my question. I remember Orban, who literally quickly flew to Moscow after Hungary took over the EU. As I understand it, he heard there that there are no compromises. And now Scholz wants to talk about what? If Putin clearly says more than once that we are ready to talk, negotiations, but taking into account the realities on the battlefield. What does Scholz want to talk about? And today, he says that India can become a mediator. And India, it seems to me, like China, is not very interested in the subjectivity of Ukraine, because the visit to Ukraine was for half a day and that transit there to Poland. This is how much Scholz is trying to end the war not on the terms of a just peace.
Look, well, as for Modi, who stopped in Kyiv, this does not mean that if he went to Poland and then and so on, that this is not a significant visit. This is quite an official visit, and it cannot be said that India ignores the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, it cannot be presented directly, sorry, India did not attack Kyiv, so we cannot directly accuse. Another question is that there are so many intermediaries, and India for you, and China, and so Turkey is active, sent some proposals from Putin to Zelenskyy, and so on. Well, it is impossible to have so many options. Do you know why this happens? From this, one says, let's Ukraine and its allies conduct any negotiations, any agreements on a ceasefire, a truce, a long-term peace and so on the basis of existing norms of international law, an understanding of international security, and so on. A very clear formula, a very clear tool. And the other side says, no, we always talk about some realities on the ground, and he is talking about the Kursk region, about realities. He again said about 4 regions that should be liberated by the armed forces of Ukraine up to the administrative borders. These are Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, Crimea for sure. In general, he considers everything his territory. These are the subjects of the Russian Federation according to the constitution. Yes, these territories are occupied. And he keeps silent about Kursk. Is this unrealistic on earth, or what? You see, they interpret everything in their favor. Well, not to mention the non-aligned status of Ukraine, the inadmissibility of its accession to NATO. That is, they interpret everything in their favor. I have not heard of any other conditions that he preliminarily puts forward. He always puts forward these ones, and on the eve of the summit on the peace formula near Lucerne in Switzerland, the same ones were heard, plus lift the sanctions. He did not say it now. We believe that he is ready to consider this not as a precondition, but in the course of these negotiations. But the problem is that if you rely on international law and the recognized sovereignty of respect for the territorial integrity of all countries in the world, then no intermediaries are needed. To do this, it is enough to have guarantors who simply organize the negotiation process itself and, in general, ensure that these principles are followed. But Moscow wants it differently. It wants to achieve its goal through the right of force. Putin said today, 60 Minutes today they showed this Skobeaver, that he says, well, why should we be disingenuous? Of course, we will be satisfied with negotiations, as a result of which Russia should win. Well, to benefit from diplomatic agreements. That is, they are satisfied with a compromise. There are compromises and compromises, only those that suit Moscow. That is, you see, he immediately says, immediately means that no other options, except for those proposed by Moscow, are accepted at all. He does not allow compromises within these conditions, which, probably, allows a compromise on other issues, unimportant, less significant. But not on these issues. Well, then what kind of compromise is this? And what kind of international law is this? I want to ask a question again. If you have occupied 4 regions, which are not yet complete, of non-administrative borders, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia, proclaim them your territories, and you say that, well, we need to proceed from this, that we have already held a referendum, declared them our territories. Well, where is international law here? Therefore, they will not be able to agree with anyone. Neither India will be able to be in the middle, nor the UN, nor China. No one would exist until everyone agrees to Moscow's conditions, and this is impossible. With what they offer, the entire world order collapses. Someone will say, but how to change this? Moscow will not improve. Well, how to change it? This means to ensure parity in everything. This means that it is necessary, so to speak, to change the situation on the battlefield, to acquire nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and then parity will arise. And now let's talk by the right of force. Well, probably so, because it doesn't work out any other way. Or, according to Moscow's logic, you just need to give up everything. It is quite obvious that by not joining NATO, Ukraine is dooming itself to a new war. Just for a new war. Any reconciliation and non-accession to NATO is fraught with the outbreak of a new war after a certain period of time. It is difficult to judge whether it will be long or short. Everything will depend on how Moscow maneuvers this period, prepares for a new war, and so on. Well, that is, it turns out to be a hopeless situation. I repeat, there is only one way out of it, which causes the least damage to Ukraine, and the damage is already huge, and that is to achieve parity, including in the nuclear field. The Budapest Memorandum does not work. If the nuclear-free status could not guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, then it is necessary to withdraw from the Budapest Memorandum, behave differently, and make other decisions. This is the logic, and all other mediations do not have any role, because the problems are not in a good mediator, you see. That's not the problem. The problem is the lack of a principle to which these agreements should be reached. And the principles differ dramatically. Therefore, it is impossible to reach an agreement at present.
Here, Mark, Timothy Snyder, the historian, said it very well. You don't think that's true? The problem is that the United States of America, yes, Ukraine's main partner, thinks it's controlling the escalation, but the Kremlin is very good at controlling fear and anxiety in the United States of America, because no matter what they do, Lloyd Austin will always say, don't escalate, don't escalate. And this is the problem, because the Kremlin knows where and what to put pressure on.
You see, the situation is even worse here. I will explain to you what it is. Again, the United States and its allies adhere to international principles of law and security. After all, what they say, judge for yourself, and we should not accept Ukraine into NATO, because the direct involvement of NATO in the current war between Russia and Ukraine will lead to more sad consequences, to a direct clash, and therefore even to a nuclear war and everything else. And Moscow is not afraid of this. Here you have it, the DPRK, a nuclear power, a military ally of Moscow. As they comment today on everything in a race, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Putin, and everyone else, as if the fact of the adoption and ratification of the agreement on mutual military assistance between Pyongyang and Moscow yesterday, as well as the presence of the North Korean military, which is no longer hidden. They have already shown me a picture, taking pictures on Red Square in Dermantine raincoats, you know, SS raincoats. I don't know if you have seen it or not, but they say that the DPRK Foreign Ministry is saying that everything is in accordance with international law. Do you understand how they understand international law? Since Russia has declared the territories its own, then the agreements concluded between the DPRK and Moscow apply to these new territories, to the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia regions. You understand how simple, you understand, international law. That is, initially his violation of Moscow's aggression by seizing Ukrainian territories is ignored. That is, the interpretation in this case proceeds from the fact that this international law does not violate. They had the right to conclude military treaties. In fact, it does. Countries that are members of the UN cannot conclude military treaties with Moscow, since the General Assembly of Moscow is actually recognized as an aggressor who violated this very international law and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And more than once. There are various resolutions on this matter, but they need to implement the UN Charter, according to which such agreements can be concluded with Ukraine, including for the supply of weapons, even for some separate agreements on the participation of Ukraine's military allies, on participation in the war. And Moscow cannot, because it is an aggressor. And those who enter into such agreements, supply weapons, are violators of international law, international security and the order established by the United Nations and its Charter, and other fundamental documents. That is, it turns out that those who follow international law and international security rules, they lose to those who violate them. And they continue to persist in this desire so as not to escalate the situation further, so as not to provoke Moscow into retaliatory actions on a larger scale. One that goes beyond the borders of Ukraine. And Moscow does not deny itself this and can involve North Korea, and tomorrow Iran will come, and tomorrow it will give them nuclear weapons, as it deployed them in Belarus, and so on. And where is the guarantee that, as they say, at the BRICS summit, presidents like the presidents of Iran and Moscow talked, and will not conclude an agreement on mutual cooperation similar to the DPRK, according to which, as in Belarus, which is the state council, they will take and deploy nuclear weapons, ensuring the security of Uranus under this agreement. Why not? Who said that this is impossible in principle? We have seen everything. So in fact I would say that the West will retreat exactly until the moment it decides to mirror any actions of Moscow on its part. That's all.
Yes, but it seems to me, Mark, in a democracy, and in the way I am primarily in Europe who listen to their population, it will be very difficult. How to explain to the average German that, listen, we will do this and that, this is not in the rules of law, but it is necessary. The German who went to work in the morning, and in the evening ate a sausage, figuratively speaking, and went to bed.
I will tell you this, but who asks them to get carried away immediately from the start of the war as such? But, for example, to grant the right to use funds that are legally provided, well, a regulatory basis in Ukraine, to strike at any targets on the territory of Russia. What is this? Does it seriously violate international law? Not at all. Weapons that have crossed the border with Ukraine, provided to it to ensure its own security, protect the population, sovereignty, territorial integrity, can be used and be Ukrainian, you know, be Ukrainian, not American, not British, not French, and so on. It can be used for any military purposes that provide this security. That is, restrictions in this case, they are not mandatory. This is just the position of Ukraine's allies in the same way, according to the same formula, in no case to escalate the situation further. Do not escalate the situation further. And how does joining NATO contradict international law? This is the sovereign right of Ukraine to join anywhere, as well as the right of the North Atlantic Alliance to accept or not accept a country like Ukraine as a member, of course. But if Ukraine wants to join NATO, then you need to decide. Do you want Ukraine to be a member of this NATO, with all the reservations, with all the conditions of war, when the occupied territories, probably, cannot immediately enter? Well, and so on. But it turns out that these fears and restrictions, which NATO is trying to publicly articulate, Talk about them, explain why they do not do this, as spreading too widely to things that absolutely do not fall into this category. Well, for example, ensuring a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Is it a direct clash with Moscow and its armed forces and the forces of the DPRK? Well, I'm just curious, to shoot down missiles, drones and everything else over the territory of Ukraine. Can NATO do this or not? A simple question, but he doesn't, you know. So the problem here is not even that you need to explain something to the population. It is possible to participate in the protection of Ukraine's interests and sovereignty, territorial integrity without losses, without consequences. Let's convert them into a world war, you know. This is what the public opinion of the population in these Western countries, in prosperous Western European countries, is afraid of, and at least the minimum that ensures the protection of the population of Ukraine. The question is what, and why should we protect Ukrainians? So you have assumed these obligations under the Budapest Memorandum. It was you who took them upon yourself. Britain, the United States, well, about China, okay, God bless him. You have taken on these obligations, so should you or should you not fulfill them? That's the question.
Well, then the global question of democracy. Why build it if you don't protect it? But Mark, you say that you need to play by Putin's rules. This is not to play by the rules at all. But here is Mark Rutte. It seemed to me that the new Secretary General would be a little tougher than Stoltenberg, but the appearance of North Korean troops at the front in Ukraine, he said, well, it will be an escalation. Well, of course, these are not peacekeepers, but it seems to me that if you follow the principle of cunning, as Moscow is doing, say that you use your own missiles, 70% of the parts are from abroad, you also use foreign weapons. Well, in some way. But if we talk about the Kursk region, the Kursk operation, don't you think that Russia has outplayed the West a little bit again? Because the West, which adheres to international law, and he says officially, as well as Ukraine, that the Kursk region is a sovereign territory of the Russian Federation. This is a temporary occupation. Well, the DPRK troops should appear in the Kursk region. And this is only a matter for Putin and the DPRK, where these troops are used on the territory of the Russian Federation.
Look, first of all, let them appear first in the Kursk region. My forecast, again, you cannot believe me, I may be wrong, I do not insist on anything at all. I believe that having said A, I will have to say B, because having the appearance of troops in the Kursk region, they will inevitably appear in the Donetsk, and in the Lugansk, and in the Zaporizhzhia, and in the Kherson region. Why? Because they have already declared, this is all the territory of the Russian Federation. They do not believe that they violate the principles of international law. This is the first thing. Secondly, look at what a thing. A country at war, such as Russia, which attacked, recognized as aggressors, is not free to conclude such agreements. It can do this only with the voluntary consent of partner countries. If North Korea goes to war, it is fully responsible for everything it does. What Russia is doing, I mean, and it should be based on the results. If we imagine that Russia loses this war, then North Korea must also lose. It must be deprived of nuclear weapons, it must be eliminated, this country. Well, logically, the South Korean army should be there as well, which is logical. Well, it should be responsible for everything that Moscow does. Moreover, the ambassador in her servicemen, regardless of how the situation develops, she accepts this responsibility. It's good if Russia wins, kicks out the armed forces of Ukraine from the Kursk region, and then also captures the territory of occupied Ukraine, then there is no demand from the winner. And if he loses, they will say that they have nothing to do with it, this is all Moscow, and we have nothing to do with it. And we went to our home in Pyongyang. Please, don't chase us, don't do anything, don't bombard us with bombs or anything else. Well, you see, this is the logic. But I wonder if a North Korean serviceman does appear on the territory of Ukraine, these 4 regions, and I do not see what can prevent them from appearing there. I have a simple question. Will Ukraine enter the war with North Korea on this basis? Because these are not just individual servicemen who themselves went voluntarily during their vacation to fight in Ukraine and kill Ukrainians. And this directly directed the state, the country's leadership, these servicemen to participate in hostilities on the territory of another state. This is not on the territory of North Korea. Well, let's say it will be limited only to the Kursk region. Suppose. But the fact that they kill servicemen of the armed forces of Ukraine, because they are not Russians, they are Koreans. They are citizens of another country, They wear the insignia of this Russian army, but probably some of them keep their insignia to show that they are North Korean servicemen. That is, they also believe that they can kill servicemen of another army without being in the conditions of war between Ukraine and the DPRK. Then explain, and then by what logic do CSTO members refuse to participate in the war on the territory of the Kursk region? I'm not talking about Ukraine now, but Armenia, Kazakhstan, Belarus are on the territory of the Kursk region, and they actually have to do it in the first place. The CSTO collective security agreement with them, yes, within the framework of this agreement, it means that they must participate in hostilities on the territory of the Kursk region. Is this logical? Logically, but, apparently, they understand that the root cause is not what is happening now in the Kursk region, but Moscow's attack on the territory of Ukraine in February 2022. And this is a consequence. This is not the root cause. This is not a provocation. These are not bandits. These are military personnel who ensure the security of their territory, but already on the adjacent territory of the enemy. This is a war between Ukraine and Russia. It is impossible to interpret it in any other way, and not some border conflicts, internal conflicts, or something else. And in the conditions of war, the front line can move back and forth. But this does not cancel who was the first to start and who is to blame. Therefore, the DPRK takes sides and must bear full responsibility for what will happen. And this happened, by the way. From this moment, or maybe earlier, when they began to actively supply ammunition and weapons to the Russian side, the DPRK must be responsible for everything. Okay, if they win the war, it's once, and if they don't, will they, just like everyone else, bounce back, and we have nothing to do with it? Like Belarus, which let Russian troops pass through its territory, and they killed Ukrainians in 2022 in February to March, like some other countries like it, Iran, for example, which, set up drones for ballistic missiles to the aggressor country, and it should be subject to an embargo. This is written in the UN Charter. It was not Ukraine that wrote it. That's what it's about. Therefore, there is too much cunning here. Let the DPRK, it be impossible to prevent this. I'm just wondering, if North Korean servicemen are captured, should Ukraine hand them over to the DPRK? Or what should she do? Are they covered by the Geneva Convention? No. Good question. Well, if they end up on the territory of Ukraine, in particular. So, you still need to figure it out. Here you cannot solve everything with one instrument of international law.
Well, here's the reaction to this slyness, obviously, which is what you're talking about, Mark. The White House knows it very well, and they don't do anything. And so I would like to recall the words of Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who said following the results of November 5th, the US presidential election in America, regardless of whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump wins before January, before the inauguration, something must happen. That's how to assess these words, what is going to happen, because what I see, if Kamala Harris is Democrats, teaspoons, help, so that you keep up like this, Trump is more dangerous, but how dangerous?
Well, look, first of all, I don't know what will happen before November 5th, there is very little time, today is the 25th.
Sorry, Mark, after the 5th, after the election.
After the 5th. Well, after the 5th, too, look, it is difficult to predict, although the pattern is more or less clear. What Kamala Harris will do is, first of all, the same thing that the current Biden administration is doing. Maybe it will have some additional intensity. Support for Ukraine is not excluded, because it is just younger, and there may not be Sullivan around it, among advisors, who is in favor of the controlled escalation of burns by the head of the CIA, and so on. There may be some changes in this sense. As for Trump, look, today, there was information that Elon Musk had communication with Putin after the start of a full-scale conflict in February 2022. Well, listen, you can, of course, guess or say anything about this, but it's strange. Either Kazan, this journalist, a close face of Trump, or Musk, who takes an active part in Donald Trump's campaign, actively participates in the campaign. But, nevertheless, both have communication, and Trump himself, as Bob Woodward wrote in the book War, recently published, the patriarch of American journalism. Well, apparently, we handed it over to the CIA or the intelligence services of American information. Trump also had communication with Putin after February 2022, and somehow the Trump headquarters reacted indistinctly on this matter. But in connection with this information and public statements by Trump and his entourage, not only his vice presidential candidate Wenz, and Elon Musk himself, and a number of others, we have reason to conclude that some intensive negotiations are underway on the surrender of Ukraine. Well, I can't see it any other way. I emphasize, maybe they have another, more cunning, more far-reaching plan, but they publicly declare something else. You see, something else is being publicly stated, so there is reason to believe that this is a group of politicians or a group from Trump's entourage, and Trump himself have an intention to protect Ukraine and provide assistance, but the grounds for this are very weak now.
Mark, I would also like to recall the declared topic in our country. This is Lukashenko, who gave an interview to the Russian media, but he is somehow very surprising. He remembered that he will defend Belarus, if anything, a war against Russia. He also said that the jure Crimea is not Russian. Why does Lukashenko make such ambiguous statements? Won't it be shared by the Kremlin?
No, he has already made all kinds of statements more than once, then some, then another. Believe me, take my word, in a couple of weeks he will say the opposite, say that we are forever with Russia, that Zelenskyy needs to agree to all the conditions of Russia, or something like that. The Kremlin forgives him for this, that's what I would say. They don't like him, Lukashenko, and he knows it very well. And they forgive him his eternal maneuvering, such a collective farm maneuvering, you know. He makes passes to one person, to another. In my opinion, he is concerned only with his own safety, to relieve himself of responsibility. He certainly does not want to be responsible for the consequences of the war, for the war as such, despite the fact that he will have to bear responsibility for it. He will not get away from it, so he periodically makes contradictory statements. And remember, in 2020, on the eve of the elections, how he gave an interview to the same Gordon. Now take him and reconsider how he spoke from Putin, about Russia, about his attempts to destabilize Belarus on the eve of the elections and so on, in August 2020, by the way. So what? Well, as it was, so it was. He says one thing today, another tomorrow. Either Volodya and I are the biggest friends, or he will pinch somewhere, then he will not agree, by the way, to launch a new attack on the territory of Ukraine from the north, from the territory of Belarus. So I would not attach so much importance. Nothing changes from these words. And in my opinion, the Kremlin knows this well.
Mark, the Central Bank of the Russian Federation has raised the discount rate to 21%. Previously, it was 20%. This is the 7th time. What am I leading to? I would like to ask you more about Russia's internal problems and how much this can affect the Russians. And in the military-industrial complex, there is a shortage of manpower, those who are not in the military-industrial complex, and how much worse it can be, and how much worse and worse economic indicators can be tolerated there.
Well, since nothing changes, the increase in the interest rate does not affect, it was 18, now it is 20%. Yes, this is a way to curb inflation and many other things related to it. Yes, it destroys industry, as representatives of the military-industrial sector say, to some from other industries. Well, they maneuver in conditions of a certain deficit, high tension, non-production costs for the war and so on, i.e. perhaps from the point of view of financial stabilization, the economic bloc of the government, the central bank, carries out even tough, but timely measures, you know, in order to keep afloat as a whole. But what margin of safety, you understand, it does not really depend, as we found out, on social changes inside, as a consequence of all these economic harsh measures. We do not yet see signs that all this will turn up in the near future, burst. There are no such signs, you see. We would look for them, but they are made of different parts, because something big, common does not add up, but there is no such thing. Therefore, the patience of the population, firstly, is to a high degree. The threshold is very high. The industry itself, well, as long as there is income from the trade in resources, well, in general, let it be bad, but it will all hold on. So I wouldn't be looking for some needle in the egg here, you know. So far, there are no signs for this.
Mark, and the last question, in your last conversation with Elena Kurbanova, you mentioned Yulia Navalnaya, that in the cult series, Sex and the City, yes, and his book, Navalny's book, sorry. And here's what interests me, you spoke of Yulia Navalnaya as a politician, as a wife. Obviously, Yulia Navalnaya is partly a project in which money is invested and which they want to promote. But don't you think that she said, yes, if I return to Russia, I will take part in the presidential election? a lot of IFS if Putin is not there. Don't you think that from the point of view of a democratic leader, someone more categorical is needed? And would it be better to look for someone from scratch in the average state of America, in whom to invest money, and not just Yulia, because her last name is Navalnaya?
Well, we don't put our brains in someone else's, we don't swap places, so it's up to the US State Department or the US administration to advise something in this sense. The fact is that it is ideologically very close. This is the same left liberal program that the current Democratic Party in the leadership of the United States adheres to. There are long-standing ties there, so there is logic in this promotion and consistent support of Yulia Navalnaya for them. The fact that this is absolute is like saying that Yulia Navalny will become president in a country in which there is a totalitarian dictatorship. Well, as if Kerensky, who was in the United States, at that moment was saying under Stalin that he would become president in a democratic election. Well, we can talk, but where will they come from, these elections? Who to bet on? For a sharper figure or, so to speak, more suitable for the Russian Philistine, so the Americans, it seems to me, understand a lot. They understand, they are just satisfied with such figures. Why? Because they know what the Russian people are. That he does not vote. He accepts the power of those who stand above him. And this is not happening in a democratic way. But there are voices that seem to say that in Russia the change of power does not take place according to the methods of this change that are usual for the Western consciousness. I don't see any prerequisites for elections or the disappearance of Putin and the holding of elections, but there are no these prerequisites. I believe that in Russia the power will change exclusively by force, and therefore Yulia Navalnaya is unlikely to be able to take part in this option.
Mark, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for taking the time to discuss important processes, and the most important are the Kazan summit, the BRICS meeting, and all further processes.
All the best.
I remind our viewers. With us was a human rights activist, YouTube blogger Mark Feygin. Please like. There is a link to Mark Feygin's YouTube channel. Also, subscribe, comment, share. This is how YouTube algorithms work so that more people, primarily Ukrainians, can review and understand geopolitical processes. My name is Ihor Havryshchak. We will traditionally see it on the air of Channel 24.